Hi guys, welcome to the Judincast. This is Social Studies 20-1, episode 15, where we're going to look at how does ultranationalism connect to crimes against humanity, and then we're going to look at what are the 8 stages of genocide. And this is continuing on with chapter 7, the second chapter of our unit on ultranationalism. So let's look at the connection between ultranationalism and crimes against humanity. So how does ultranationalism contribute to crimes against humanity? Well, people's dedication to their nation can help it grow and prosper, and strong, charismatic leaders can instill feelings of pride. Now, you may recall from chapter 6, where we talked about ultranationalism, that ultranationalist states usually have charismatic leaders that can rally this type of ultranationalism. And ultranationalist states demand dedication to their nation. But this passion in ultranationalism and strong leaders can also lead to the excesses of ultranationalism. When one group of people commits crimes against other groups because they are different, because they are ultimately make up a different nation. And if you look at this, this kind of shows you the path towards crimes against humanity. Starts out with nationalism, leads to ultranationalism, which can lead to racism, violence, crimes against humanity. Now, this is not to suggest that only ultranationalist states can commit crimes against humanity, but many different nations that we would not necessarily consider ultranationalist states have committed crimes against humanity in various forms. But ultranationalist states tend to be more likely to more likely to cause crimes against humanity towards other groups. You may recall we talked about how ultranational states usually have controlled participation. So you're only allowed to participate in a manner in which the state dictates. They use force and terror to control their population, so no one will dare speak out against them. They use indoctrination. So their citizenry is indoctrinated into the beliefs and values of the nation. And finally, they often like to use scapegoats. They like to blame other groups for any sort of problems in society, and that deflects attention away from the state. So ultranationalist states are very likely to contribute to commit crimes against humanity, I should say. Ultranationalist states often have state-sponsored acts of murder, and you're going to see some of those examples a bit later in this chapter. These acts are linked to the national interests of the state, that they come to believe that murder is necessary to pursue their country's national interests. They often will utilize mass propaganda and targeting groups in society. Like I said, ultranationalist states always use scapegoating, indoctrination, and being part of a ultranational state involves a lot of peer pressure. And this can play a significant role in why people are willing to commit these crimes against humanity. So that's the connection between ultranationalism and crimes against humanity. So how does ultranationalism contribute to crimes against humanity? Review here. Nationalist states, they usually have state-sponsored acts of murder. These acts are usually linked to the national interests of the state. Ultranational states use propaganda and indoctrination. They use scapegoating to target groups in society. And there's a lot of peer pressure when you're involved in an ultranationalist state. Okay, so let's look next at the 8 stages of genocide. So these stages have been identified for the analysis of various historical genocides. Social scientists have suggested that most genocides will incorporate all, and if not all, many of these stages. So these are the 8 stages of genocide, and I'll talk about each one briefly. First being classification, then symbolization, then dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, extermination, and eventually, of course, denial. So the first stage, when a genocide is potentially going to be committed starts with classification. So the point of this is that there's a fairly linear path towards extermination. It doesn't start with extermination, and there's early clues that it could potentially end in something such as murder and extermination. Now, the first step is classification, and that means distinguishing people into us versus them. And that can be based on ethnicity, race, religion, nationality. So, for example, German versus Jew, Hutu versus Tutsi, etc. Um, Bipolar societies that lack mixed categories are the most likely to have genocide. So you have a clear difference between us versus them. So the first thing you're doing is you're classifying them. You're identifying them as Jewish, as different, or as Hutu, as different. Second, there is so with the second stage of genocide, giving names or symbols to the aforementioned classifications. So the first step, of course, is classifying them as different groups, as us versus them. With symbolization, you're actually distinguishing people by color or dress and applying symbols to group members. Using names such as Jew, Gypsy, distinguishing colors or dress, naming, but not necessarily does not necessarily result in genocide, unless they lead to the next stage, which we'll talk about, which is dehumanization. So, an example that some of you might be familiar with here is that the Nazis made the Jews wear the Star of David around their arm. And this, of course, is a symbol of Judaism, and came to symbolize them as a distinct group within the various European societies that the Germans ruled over. So, first stage is classifying them. Second stage, you link symbols to them, and the next stage is you start to dehumanize them. So you deny the humanity of the other group. Members are equated with animals, vermin, insects, or diseases, and you see this in a lot of propaganda on print, radios, used to vilify the other group. Dehumanization overcomes the normal human revulsion against murder, and this is a very important step because most normal humans are repulsed by the idea of murder. But it's a lot easier to accept when you don't even see them as human. So ultranationalist states typically dehumanize various groups that are of interest and are potentially could become targets. So you can kind of see some examples in the propaganda here, wherever it is a bat, a rat, or a gorilla. Various groups are portrayed as not being human, and thus it makes it easier for potential genocide or crimes against humanity to be carried out against this group. So once you've classified them, you've symbolized them, you've established symbols for them, sorry, and you've dehumanized them, now the path towards genocide starts to get organized. So this means organizing plans for genocide, of course, usually by the state. And as I mentioned, in most cases, ultranationalist states. They often use militias to provide deniability of state responsibility to kind of distance the state from what is happening in terms of the genocide. Um, Sometimes the organization is informal, like the Hindu mobs led by local RSS militants, or decentralized, such as terrorist groups. But once you've classified, you've symbolized groups, you've dehumanized them, the first step, next major step towards genocide is organizing. Then comes the process of polarization. So hate groups broadcast polarizing propaganda. Laws may forbid intermarriage or social interaction. This is the increasing division of society. Extremists are seeking to drive groups apart. So they're trying to expand the differences between the groups to really highlight the differences between the groups and to create hate and distrust towards the targeted group. Often part of this stage is the targeting of moderates. So people that do not want to necessarily commit genocide, um, and they're not necessarily supporters of the ultranational state or the group that seeks to carry out genocide, but they're not members of the target group either. And it's important to get rid of the moderates because these are the last checks that can stop a potential genocide. This could include other political leaders, members of the Supreme Court, etc., basically intimidating and silencing anyone left that could speak out against this polarization. That it's basically you're either with us or you're against us. There's no moderate position allowed. There's no centrist position. You're either with us or you're against us. So after polarization, now is the step towards genocide. And that first step is preparation. So, separating victims because of their ethnic or religious identity, death lists are drawn up, property is expropriated, um, members of groups are forced to wear their identifying symbols that we talked about. They're often segregated into ghettos, deported into concentration camps, confined to famine-struck region, and starve. So this is the first step, separating, actually physically separating whatever group is being targeted from the majority. Then comes the extermination. After the group is being separated, comes extermination. So the mass killing is legally called genocide that we talked about. And genocide is the intentional extermination, eradication of a particular group. And a group can be based off of any sort of identity, whether it's ethnic, religious, racial. So it is extermination to the killers because they do not believe the victims to be fully human, right? They, at this point, have dehumanized the other ethnic group. So their state-sponsored often results with armed forces working with the militias to do the killing. Sometimes results in revenge killings by groups against each other. So this is, of course, the stage in which that group is annihilated, or there's an attempt to annihilate that group. And the final stage is the stage of denial, where the perpetrators deny committing any crimes. They often blame what happened on the victims, covering up evidence, intimidating witnesses. And this is among the surest indications of further genocidal massacres, that they're not obviously accepting responsibility for what occurred, that there would be a potential for genocide to happen again because there's been no lessons learned. Perpetrators dig up the mass graves, burn the bodies, try to cover up evidence, intimidate witnesses, block investigations, and continue to govern until driven out by force and then flee into exile. So the final stage after the extermination has occurred is denial. So just to review the stages of genocide, now it is generally linear, but it doesn't not always have to be linear. So the general order is, of course, classification, symbolization, dehumanization, organization, polarization, preparation, extermination, and denial. You can jump ahead in various areas and go and jump backwards. It doesn't have to always be in a linear order, but generally they've identified that this is the order in which it goes by. And some stages need to be preceded by earlier stages. You can't really get the extermination part without the preparation part going on. So that concludes this Judincast. And I'm going to have an assignment for you to review these 8 stages of genocide. Next Junecast, we're going to talk about some specific case studies from history that are examples of genocides. So that's it for today. Take care.